what do you think? Should we return these kinds of things? There's all kinds of Native American goods, Native American artifacts in museums all around the world. There's skulls, bodies, skeletons in not just public museums, but in academic institutions. Archaeology institutions in particular have all kinds of these things that they study. It's not just human remains, but there are some things, human remains, but there are also things like ceremonial clothing and headdresses and those kinds of things. Should those things, who owns that stuff? I mean, some of these things are 100 years old, some are 500 years old, some are 1,000 years old. The Elgin marbles, the things that are called the Elgin marbles, go back to the 5th century, BCE. So 2,500 years ago or more. Greece has been, Athens in particular, has been constantly occupied since then. Is this their stuff? Should they be returned, or is it everybody's stuff? What do y'all think? Let's actually, since we wanted to start with a question there to just talk about it, then I'll give you my spiel here. I have a particular view about this stuff, although my argument applies more to minority groups rather than states. So I'll qualify that in a little bit. But what do you think? I mean, is there any sort of intuition, any sort of bite you might have in this idea that cultural property, stuff that antiquities, artwork, ceremonial outfits, human remains, belong to any particular culture, or do they belong to everybody as sort of the history of humanity? Go for it, Mr. Cardoza.
I was just thinking that as far as the artifacts themselves are concerned, if someone's had them for, let's say, 100, 200 years, my only fear is that in transport, or that they're going to get damaged, or if they're set up somewhere else, why aren't they protected as where they are right now? I mean, if everybody can still see them, and the culture still gets, credit that that's theirs, what are the new people going to do with it? That's my concern. I mean, are they just going to put it out somewhere? Or obviously, it's protected where it is.
That's true.
So that's my thinking of it.
That's true. There are Native American cultures. There's something called the Native American Grave Repatriation Act. It's a mouthful. It's usually just called NAGPRA. Now, if you've taken an anthro class, a cultural anthro class in particular, you'll probably hear about it. It's a law that was passed in the early 90s that basically says we have to give that institutions that have cultural goods, particularly grave goods of Native American cultures, have to give it back, or at least offer it back. And often, if they are returned, often the first thing that these groups will do is bury them somewhere secret. For all intents and purposes, lost to science. So there's this potential for a large loss of artwork, of knowledge about humanity's past, and so on. Even if they want to preserve it, there are issues about how they might preserve it, the quality. One of the big arguments that the British have used against the Greeks' call for the return of the Elgin marbles is that the acid rain and the smog in Athens are so bad that if they put them outside, they'd soon disintegrate, and that the technology for enclosed methods of presentation were not up to par for the kind of highest standards of archaeological preservation. That's changed a bit, by the way. The Greeks just recently opened in 2009, I think, 2009. A state-of-the-art museum designed to hold the Elgin marbles, actually. They have a replica of the Parthenon, and they have the original artwork that the Greeks still own. They're there. And then they have the stuff that's preserved well enough to be on public display is there. Then the stuff that they own but is not preserved well enough to be on public display, they have casts of that they don't label as casts. They're a slightly different color than the original stuff. And then the stuff that's in foreign museums is in plaster, bright white, whitish yellow, I mean, like much, much brighter than any of the real stuff, to indicate that here's where this goes, and oh, what, by the way, this is in Berlin. Or, oh, by the way, this is in London. So you can walk around a whole representation, life-size, of the Parthenon and you see all these big swaths of white for the artwork that's somewhere else. And little teeny chunks of dark brown, dark gray artwork. So it's their sort of way of presenting this in a way as a protest. To say, see, we've come up to the standard, we've got stuff that matches the standards you're complaining about, and you still won't give it back to us.
I was just going to comment on that as far as the countries themselves are concerned. The United Kingdom is a very stable nation. Like when we saw, when they had that uprising in Egypt, a lot of the stuff was looted. So I mean, that's another concern too, is getting it back to a country that might not be able to protect it. So
physical protection. Okay, yeah, that's a good point.
That's what I was thinking about that.
I'm about to give you an argument against that. Although, actually, unfortunately, I started thinking about this, right? If you imagine a slide here, the title of my talk is Who Owns the Past? National Cultural Heritage or the Heritage of Humankind? I got interested in this topic because of the Elgin marbles. And I've worked out this argument that I don't think actually applies to the Greek cakes for the Elgin marbles. In archaeology and in some respects history and museum studies and stuff, there's this sort of raging debate between two outlooks on items of historical or archaeological interest, antiquities, artwork that are culturally significant and those kinds of things. One outlook says that these things are the property of nations, of cultures. Right? This is called the National Cultural Heritage outlook. By the way, for the purposes of this talk, there are a lot of different disciplines that are involved here and have something at stake in this. And they use they all use different terminology, so I want to be careful. Sometimes I'll use culture and ethnic group and nation interchangeably. So when I talk about a nation, I mean sort of a group of people that have a certain kind of national identity. Often it's based on ethnicity, but it could just be based on something entirely non-biological, cultural customs, or those kinds of things. I want to just be clear that I do not mean state. If I mean something with a government that's recognized internationally, I will call that a state. Okay? So this view of national cultural heritage is talking about these smaller groups, not states, but ethnic groups, cultural communities, and those kinds of things. The people who produced these things, even if it's their ancestors, right? That these things are the cultural heritage of the group that produced them, and so by rights belong to the descendants of the creators of these pieces of art. The bodies belong to their descent, right? The human remains belong to the descendants, as long as there are some, right? There are cases where, I'll get to you in a second, Mr. Miller, there are cases where there aren't any identifiable descendants of the originators of this artwork. My argument doesn't apply to cases like that. So if there are, some Olmec art or something. And here I'm going out on a limb. I don't know whether or not there is still any Olmecs around. Because there are still Mayans and Aztecs around. Olmecs are a much older culture. Supposing there aren't any Olmecs, then this view doesn't say, the Olmec cultural stuff, cultural goods, there aren't any descendants to claim that it belongs to them. So this national cultural heritage view says there has to be sort of a cultural chain, right? A continually existing culture, and so descendants of the originators of the artworks, or descendants of the people who the remains are of. This view says they own that stuff. Mr. Miller, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, in regards to the art, not necessarily the bodies and all that stuff, but with the art, the people that have it now, do they procure it legally? Like buy it from some organization or some person?
Some do and some don't. The view that the conflict I'm talking about will only deal with legal acquisitions, because illegal, acquisitions that violate international law, that's problematic on its own right. There are state claims and national claims there. Right? It's very common. There's a huge trade, particularly in South American art and certain African cultures, African cultural artifacts, where people will go into old mounds where there are just huge piles of stuff because the cultures have just sort of lived in the same spot and built on the remains of previous cultures and stuff. You can just dig in there and get all kinds of pottery, sometimes remains and stuff, and they'll siphon it out of the country and sell it on the international market. It's clearly stolen stuff. Whether there are any cultural descendants, right? Whether there are any people of that nation that's still around, it violates state laws, right? So if you're smuggling stuff out of El Salvador, say, you're doing something illegal on an international level too. The argument I'm going to be dealing with, though, deals with, all right, let's assume that it was acquired legally. Right? We didn't violate any international laws in the acquisition of this material. There's still a view, this national cultural heritage view, that says these things should be repatriated back. Repatriation just means kind of given back. They should be repatriated to the descendants of the people who made them, the descendants of whoever, if it's human remains, the descendants of those people. Mr. Miller?
Yeah. So if they bought them, are they just expecting them to give them back to the culture, or offer to let them buy it back?
Okay, now that's a good question. Because sometimes these are bought, sometimes they're traded for, right? Some of these have been acquired, a couple hundred years ago. Right? Napoleon, a lot of Egyptian stuff is in Europe right now because Napoleon led an expedition into Egypt and he had a whole bunch of scientists and stuff to measure the pyramids and stuff and just take ziggurats and anything else they could carry away. So there's all kinds of stuff in Paris and Berlin and England from Egypt that just from people marching in and we're taking over your country. And now we're going to leave and we're going to take a lot of your shit with us. So some of it's bought, some of it's not. This view that says these need to be repatriated, sometimes they'll say they should just be given back. It was never your. It's too bad you paid for it, but it was never your right to. You shouldn't have been able to pay for it in the first place. Typically, when we're talking about states rather than nations, because when we're talking about nations and ethnic or cultural groups, we're often talking about, and particularly the ones I'm going to be talking about, are typically very poor folks that are victims of various sorts of prejudices and so on. They don't have the means to buy stuff back in the first place. But when we're talking at the level of states, the states are often willing to trade something or buy them back or something along those lines. Well, one of the reasons why there's this debate, by the way, is that it's enshrined. There's sort of both of these views. The national cultural heritage view that I've been describing. There are certain international treaties that seem to support it. international and national, both. NAGPRA is an American law. It's an act, I guess. But it clearly supports this view that essentially Native American goods should be offered back to the nation of origin, and the only things that museums should be keeping are things that the tribes don't want. Now, by the way, I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm generalizing about the laws here. There are some arguments about exactly fine lines about what applies and what doesn't, what kinds of goods are covered by the law and what aren't. So when I say pretty much everything, that might be a slight exaggeration, but certainly a lot of stuff in museums and in academic collections and stuff are being required. I mean, here at Sac State, we have the anthropology department has an actual person whose job it is to repatriate stuff because of their job is to enforce NAGPRA. That's he also, as more and more stuff gets dealt with, he'll have more and more of a teaching load. But right now, I think he teaches one class. The rest of his job is to deal with NAGPRA and the collection of Native American, well, it's not just Native American, but specifically the NAGPRA stuff. His job is to enforce it because they've got so much stuff and it's not